The Russia Hand is Strobe Talbot's new memoir of his State Department days. He spoke recently at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City with Newsweek international editor Fareed Zakaria. Recalling his time as President Clinton's top advisor on Russia, Mr. Talbot offers an eyewitness account of the evolving relationship between Clinton and Boris Yeltsin and describes how he and his State Department colleagues tackled arms control, the expansion of NATO, the ceasefire in Chechnya, and American missile defense. This program runs just under an hour.
Hi, Andrew. Nice to see you.
All right. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Council. This is a very special meeting for two reasons. One, we have Strobe Talbot with us, and two, this is on the record. I think it inevitably is on the record because there are cameras here for C-SPAN, but I thought I'd begin by introducing our guest, not that he needs much of an introduction. I've always thought that I had an interesting career as a young journalist, but then I discovered when I was very young that Strobe Talbot, when he was, I think, 22 years old or 23 years old, began translating Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs. This happened when he was at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. What I did not know until I read his book is that the man who helped him get through that translation, mostly by cooking omelets for him, was Bill Clinton, who was his housemate at Oxford at the time. From there, Strobe goes on to an extraordinary career at Time magazine, ending up as their foreign policy columnist. He then joins the administration as a special advisor on Russia, or actually on all former Soviet states, and then becomes Deputy Secretary of State. So I guess the first question I would ask Strobe is, you went in one of these very rare shifts from being an observer of foreign policy at the highest levels to actually being a practitioner of foreign policy at the highest levels. What's the thing that surprised you most? What's the big change?
Well, first, Fareed, thanks for doing this, and thanks to all of you for joining in this conversation. This will sound a little bit like a wisecrack, perhaps. I don't mean it that way. In some ways, the biggest surprise about going from outside the door through whose keyhole I'd been looking all of those years to the other side was that there weren't too many surprises. I think that many of us looking at government from the outside assume that there are secrets into which one is initiated, both secrets of information and secrets of procedure that make the world easier for our public officials to deal with. I don't know if this is good news or bad news, but it ain't so. And I had, of course, studied the workings of government, and particularly foreign policy, and particularly the making of policy towards the Soviet Union and Russia for a long time. And yet, even with that background, I had expected there to be more by way of, if not recipe books, then at least kind of an infrastructure of knowledge and procedure that in fact was the case. The other thing that didn't really surprise me, but that certainly impressed itself upon me early on, is the consequences of decisions. When I was in your line of work for 21 years, it's the only profession I ever chose. I loved it very, very much. And one of the great things about journalism is that you can take a new crack at a tough issue every week. Maybe some of your readers, Henry, maybe even some of your editors will notice if you change your opinion from time to time. But when you're in government and at work helping others make high policy, It's, you have to stick with the line and see it through. And course correction is a lot harder than it is observing from the outside and commenting from the outside.
I want to begin substantively by asking you, in a sense, why you wrote this book. There have always been two kinds of people who observed the Soviet Union. People who were interested in Russia and people who were interested in the Soviet Union. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was a professor of Soviet studies as the wall was coming down. And he was deeply dismayed because he said, what I was interested in was this weird social experiment called communism being imposed upon this big society and the consequences it had around the world. Now all I'm left with is Russia. And I was never that interested in Russia in the first place. Now, you've always had an extraordinary interest in Russia, Russian literature, Russian art, Russian music. Is that part of the reason why you chose to focus this book on Russia? Because you were, by the end, the Deputy Secretary of State. You were dealing with all kinds of issues. Why is this book focused in on that one relationship?
Well, I suspect in some ways what you imply is true, and that is that I was indulging a personal, long-standing interest in that country and America's relations with that country. I had done a number of previous books, and this is kind of another in a series. I was on much better terms with my principal source this time than I had ever been in the past. But beyond that, which is personal and really parochial, I felt, and I don't think there's too much dispute about it, that the U.S.-Russian relationship is of immense, if not unique, importance, that this presidency's attempt to deal with that relationship would loom large in how that presidency is ultimately judged by history. Moreover, the extent to which the state-to-state relationship was crystallized in the personal relationship between the two presidents struck me as more than just an interesting fact, but of real operational significance in terms of the results of the policy. President Clinton and President Yeltsin met 18 times. That's as many times as all 9 of President Clinton's predecessors, going back to Harry Truman and the Potsdam meeting with Stalin, had met with their Kremlin counterparts put together. And beyond the quantitative uniqueness of the Clinton-Yeltsin relationship, it was also both intense, I think in some areas, and we'll no doubt want to talk about that, quite productive. And it was also fraught with great difficulties, some of which were rooted in what was going on in Russia, others of which were rooted in difficulties in the United States and with the Clinton presidency, and still others inherent to the relationship itself. And I wanted, before too much time had passed, to put down the story as I had both seen it and lived it. Now, I don't make any claims to this being the definitive account of what happened. Obviously, there's always a Rashomon effect. Other people will have different perspectives, and I hope in due course others who participated in the policy will write their own versions of things. But because so much of U.S.-Russian relations was transacted at the presidential level, and because I was at President Clinton's usually right hand, the note taker, I did have a unique perspective on it, and I wanted not only to get down the factual record, but also to recall as honestly and fully as I could how things looked to us at the time, what we felt we were dealing with, what we saw the trade-offs to be, and why we made the decisions that we did.
Well, the book is wonderfully written, and one of the things you get a sense of in the book is the relationship between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin. But I want to ask you about that. It does seem as though the relationship got extremely personal, in the sense that there was an enormous personal reliance on Yeltsin and a belief that Yeltsin personally was going to transform Russia, or that supporting Yeltsin personally was very important. You recount a time where as soon as Clinton is elected, he says, I want to go and meet with Yeltsin because he wants to meet with me. He's obviously in trouble, and a meeting with the American president would shore him up. some people have criticized that kind of emphasis. I remember Henry Kissinger once saying foreign policy is not psychotherapy, with reference particularly to one of these Bill and Boris meetings. How would you respond to a charge like that?
Well, I've read Henry Kissinger's memoirs, and I can assure you that he certainly practiced some psychotherapy on his counterparts over the years. Obviously, foreign policy is not just personal relations and certainly not just psychotherapy. But the relationship between the American president and the Russian president does have extraordinary importance, and I would say particularly during this particular period, where Russia was undergoing a transition from a very different kind of state. In the old Soviet Union, even though there was always a top guy, he presided over a system that made the decisions. In the case of Russia, of post-Soviet Russia, that system had pretty well collapsed. And much of the decision-making power did reside with one man, Boris Yeltsin. Regardless of whether we thought he was a good guy or a bad guy or wanted to call him a friend or a partner, he was going to make the decisions. And therefore, we, or anybody, would absolutely have to deal with him. And as it turned out, on those issues, which were mostly in the foreign policy area, that is, that have to do with Russian foreign policy and behavior abroad, President Clinton, by engaging with Yeltsin and developing this personal bond, was able to get President Yeltsin to come around to positions that we felt were certainly in the American interest, and we would have argued, did argue, in the Russian interest as well. We can, again, talk about some of those, but they include everything from stopping the sale of Russian rocket engine parts to the Indians, to getting the Russian troops out of the Baltics on time, to bringing the Russians into a position of some acquiescence with NATO enlargement, to having the Russians participate under NATO command in Balkan peacekeeping, and so forth and so on. Those issues simply couldn't be done at a lower level. I worked very closely, obviously, with my two immediate bosses, Warren Christopher and Madeleine Albright. I worked with them as they tried to get these issues resolved with their various Russian counterparts in the foreign ministry, and with Yeltsin himself. And what we heard over and over again from Yeltsin was, this is too important to leave to you people. This is something Bill and I will have to decide, which is one reason that President Clinton had to keep going back there and having those meetings.
What was he like, Yeltsin? Will history look at him as a great reformer, as a Democrat, the man who killed communism, or will it look at him as the man who created an extraordinary oligarchy in Russia, who in a way stigmatized the very idea of a market economy because he allowed a privatization that was really a kind of privatization that went directly from communism to robber baron capitalism with nothing intervening or since. What's your sense of what people will think of him?
Well, all of the above and then some will be part of the nuanced and complete judgment, of course, but you're asking me for kind of a bottom line. And I think that the bottom line will be positive. And I think you touched on it in the menu that you gave me to pick from. I think the important lasting contribution of Boris Yeltsin will turn out to be that he did drive a stake through the heart of the Soviet communist system. Now, looking back on the early 90s and the mid-90s, it may be hard for people to remember how very dangerous and uncertain those times were. Particularly in '93, when Yeltsin was locked in a showdown with the Soviet-era parliament, but again in 1996, when he was written off by just about everybody except for Bill Clinton in the race for the presidency with Gennady Zyuganov. There were other outcomes very imaginable for Russia. And I think Yeltsin's strengths included an absolute stubborn determination that he wasn't going to let that happen. Another strength that he had was that even though he was deeply conflicted and contradictory as a Democrat He used to use the verb in Russian, which derives from the word czar, tsarstvovats. He would say, when he would say, I'm commanding something or I'm making a decision, he would use a word which meant as though I were a czar. But on a number of key occasions, he did let the people decide. He let elections go forward, even though he came close to pulling the plug on the elections in 1996. He did let those elections occur. And by the way, President Clinton used some influence with him at the time. The weaknesses, God knows we can talk about. They were there. They were very conspicuous. The extent to which his most famous bad habit obtruded even on the private relationship with President Clinton and really, I think, contributed to some pretty scary moments. That is, his boozing will be more apparent to those of you who read this book, but it certainly won't come as a revelation that he had that problem as well as others.
I don't want you to go out running to buy this book if you think there are going to be vast details about Yeltsin's boozing. But let's take the, what some would argue was one of his most serious mistakes, indeed a mistake that czars had made before him, the way in which he handled Chechnya. It's not simply that it violates human rights in all kinds of ways, which it does, but it seems to have not solved the problem. It seems to have placed Russia in a kind of perpetual military campaign just at a time when it needs to solve its own Algeria problem, if you will, if you use the French analogy, and focus in on reform. Did you try to make this case to him, and why do you think he was so unresponsive?
Well, let me start with the mea culpa here. And I do dwell on this in that chapter of the book. I think we, the American side, and I personally, as somebody who bore some responsibility as an advisor to the president, were much too late in understanding the magnitude of the threat that the war in Chechnya posed, not just to the miserable and long-suffering people of the North Caucasus, and not just to the Caucasus region as a whole, but to Russia itself. I think it's not the most original metaphor in the world, but it's appropriate. I think Chechnya really is a cancer on the body politic of Russia's infant democracy and could kill it. Particularly now that there has been a recurrence. Now with regard, and we just didn't see that. We weren't paying enough attention to that remote corner. We were preoccupied with lots of other issues, I would argue reasonably important ones, but we did not understand the importance of this one that was coming up at us out of nowhere. We came to see it, and we put the issue very much on the agenda. Now, with regard to Yeltsin, without making any excuses for him and the extent to which he let himself, I think, more than anything be manipulated at a time when his health in general was not good into the first war in Chechnya, he did get Russia out of that war. He empowered General Lebed to negotiate a ceasefire, which involved significant concessions to the Chechens, and the war did end in 1996. Now, at some point, the name Vladimir Putin will probably come up in our conversation, and we can talk about the Second Chechen War. But my point here is that Chechnya was, in a way, characteristic of a more general pattern that we saw with Yeltsin. He would sort of stumble and lurch and bluster and kind of awkwardly throw himself about in getting to the right position. He never should have gotten into the war in Chechnya, but he did get himself out. And his successor got Russia back into the war and shows no sign of getting out. That's an important difference between the two. There are a lot of other differences we can talk about.
Well, let's talk about him, since you brought him up. Again, one could, if one were to be, wish to be a critic, one could say that the Clinton administration misread Putin. That Vladimir Putin comes to power and seems to be treated by the Clinton administration as a kind of low-level KGB flunky who's, who's come to power and isn't going to amount to much. And he seems to have, at the very least, asserted a kind of control and discipline over the decision-making that is quite extraordinary, has been able to sign a whole series of deals rather effectively with the new administration. Do you think you missed something in him when you were in the first meetings?
You bet, and so did everybody. I do not know anybody who saw in Vladimir Putin, when he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, or when he was the head of the Security Council, or when he was the prime minister, the potential even for making it to the presidency, much less being as successful in many respects a president as he has been. I dealt with him in 3 of those 4 capacities that he held before he became president of Russia. And I was astonished when President Yeltsin designated him to be his heir apparent. I think, by the way, that Yeltsin, who no doubt was operating on the advice of family and friends, saw in Putin some things that we did not fully appreciate, including the extent to which Putin was kind of the un-Yeltsin. That is, he was different from Yeltsin in so many conspicuous respects that he would appeal to the Russian electorate, that he would have a calming influence while Yeltsin had kept Russia roiled up all of those years. In other words, I think that in some ways, a last piece of evidence of Boris Yeltsin's surviving political acuity was his designation and indeed manipulation of Putin into the presidency.
Do you look at what Putin is doing now? The accumulation of power, he's weakened the regional governors, he's weakened the Duma, the parliament, he's weakened pretty much every competing source of authority, while at the same time appearing to produce some kind of movement on economic reform, tax reform, things like that. Is this a kind of Pinochet model that will work, or do you think at the end of the day it is not going to be good for Russian democracy to have a kind of super presidency?
Well, the honest and short answer is I don't know. I am confident that when we end up, when we have enough experience and perspective to make a judgment, we will not be talking about a Pinochet model. I suspect we may be talking about a Putin model, which will be quite different. And we may see that model adopted elsewhere if it continues to be reasonably successful in Russia. In some ways, of course, every leader wants to minimize the extent to which competing sources of power and decision-making can get in the way of his program. There's nothing new in that. It is also the case that Russia had become borderline chaotic in its political structure. A lot of the regional leaders, the governors and so forth that Putin has reined in are not, believe me, philosopher kings or Jeffersonian Democrats. You know, there are whole swatches of Russia and the old Soviet Union that are kind of, you know, Jurassic theme parks for the bad old days of the Soviet Union. So we shouldn't shed too many tears about all aspects of that. What worries me about Putin, and where I think that the instincts that derive from his alma mater, that is the KGB, are most dangerously apparent, is with regard to the independent media and with regard to Chechnya, which we've already touched on. I guess if I could just make, Fareed, one more point, and that is about our influence over him. I think we have a lot. And I think President Bush has at least as much influence over President Putin as President Clinton had over President Yeltsin, and perhaps more. What we saw on September 11th and the Russian response to September 11th, which was, by the way, Vladimir Putin's response, was an intuition, I think probably that occurred to Putin in a matter of hours, that September 11th represented a strategic opportunity for Russia to accelerate its alignment with the West. And that was rooted in Putin's conviction that if Russia is going to succeed, if he is Russia's president is going to succeed, Russia has got to go West. And that means, of course, largely in terms of the economy, but more generally. And we can talk more about that. But the point is, he knows the importance that the United States has as the chairman of many of the boards, as it were, and an influential presence even in those organizations that the United States isn't a member of, like the European Union and the Council of Europe and so forth and so on. And that means that we have the ability with him to say there are still norms and rules that you and Russia have to abide by if you're going to get the full benefits of integration. And those rules and norms notably include matters internal to your country. We're past the point. We got past the point, I think, in the 90s at least, where the defense of impenetrable sovereignty prevented these issues from figuring on the international agenda. That's what the wars in the Balkans were largely about. And I think Putin does understand that, but I think we're underplaying that influence now. Chechnya has pretty well fallen off the list of discussion points between the United States and Russia right now, and I haven't heard very much about the free press either.
Do you think, you mentioned several points in the book, that Clinton was obsessed with the idea, or at least concerned about the idea, of coming up with a kind of successor phrase, if not doctrine, to the idea of containment. And you described this fascinating conversation at one point between yourself, Warren Christopher, and George Kennan. And Kennan tells you, for God's sakes, don't come up with a successor phrase. The problem with containment, to the extent that there was one, was that it was a bumper sticker rather than a paragraph. Post-September 11th, do you think we have come up with a phrase, and are you comfortable with the age of terrorism, the war on terrorism?
No. I don't have a better one. Let me just tell you a little follow-up on the anecdote that you just recounted. I sat down with President Clinton and I told him about the conversation with George Kennan, and I was trying to basically get President Clinton to relax a little bit on this phrase-mongering issue and just not worry quite so much about what we were going to call the era in which we live. We could really pay more attention to the substance. And I said, you know, George Kennan made a strong argument that we should think in terms of paragraphs rather than bumper stickers. And President Clinton sort of rolled his eyes and he says, well, that's why George Kennan's a terrific professor and you were a terrific journalist, but you're not politicians. And politicians, not only for their own purposes, but for purposes of communicating to their larger constituencies, do need to have labels for the era. Now, the folks associated with George W. Bush used to gig us on this issue too. And after September 11th, Secretary Powell proudly proclaimed, or not proudly proclaimed, emphatically proclaimed that we were now in the we had seen the end of the Cold War, of the post-Cold War era. This, by the way, is something that a colleague of mine at Yale, John Lewis Gaddis, had said a couple of weeks before. So what phrase has the Bush administration come up with for the new era? The post-Cold War era. That'll fit on a bumper sticker, but I don't think it's going to last. And I certainly hope we're not in the age of terror.
Let me ask you one question before we open it up to the audience. Russia has gone through, as you know, these waves of an attraction toward the West and then a repulsion, not a repulsion, or at least a distancing itself from it. The great debates between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles of the 18th and 19th century. Do you think is Putin's move to the West part of a broad secular change, or do you believe that there is still danger of this historical cycle repeating itself? I ask this because, as you know, many people within Russia are quite critical of Putin for the moves that he has made, and given that, you know, capitalism doesn't have a terribly good rap in Russia right now, democracy has an okay rap, Putin's westward moves, if something goes bad, is there a danger that we move back to a kind of isolated Russia?
Yeah, and of course, the choice you're giving me is not completely either or. I mean, both propositions, I think, can be true. My sense, and it's obviously highly intuitive, is, and no doubt reflects some wishful thinking, is that Russia, if all else permits, will leave its own version of exceptionalism behind and join the rest of the world. And the great debate between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers will be resolved in favor of the latter. I think by the time that that happens, maybe westernizer won't be the right term anymore. It'll have more to do with internet, global community, and global culture. But one of the reasons that insofar as there's anything empirical underlying my conviction and hope, it's my sense that the split is largely generational. The younger people that I know in Russia seem to have joined the world and are comfortable with the idea of Russia joining the world in a way that older folks are not. That's not too surprising, of course, but I think it is positive. But there are any of a number of scenarios where things could go very bad, and Russia could slip backwards or in a very ugly way sideways, no doubt about it.
Well, now the more interesting part, which is your questions. Could you wait for a microphone so that we get this recorded, and we'll move on. Padma, and you should identify yourselves, please.
I'm Padma Desai. I'm the Harriman Professor at Columbia University. From Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin, it would seem to me that all the three presidents, Putin so far, have emphasized foreign policy, very activist foreign policy, and have had successes in foreign policy. But both Gorbachev and Yeltsin had a sort of a sinking star trajectory with respect to their own populations.
In terms of their own popularity?
Yes, in terms of their own popularity. Do you think, as a historian, as a foreign policy analyst and a foreign policy maker, that Putin will end up with a similar fate, or do you see something different in him as a tactician, as a slow mover, where he might have greater successes on the domestic front also, which is what is necessary?
Well, I think your last question, which of course you've written a lot about yourself, is critical. You know, it's the economy stupid principle. If the Russian economy continues to make modest but nonetheless unmistakable progress, that will obviously greatly help the standing of whoever the president of Russia is. But I think, yes, Putin stands a pretty good chance of leaving office more popular than either of his predecessors. Now, that's not saying a whole lot, given that Gorbachev was the most unpopular man in the Soviet Union at the end of the Soviet Union, and Boris Yeltsin came pretty close to the same distinction. In fact, Gorbachev was more popular than Yeltsin in Russia at the end of the Yeltsin presidency. But there are, as the Soviets used to say, objective reasons for those two earlier cases. In the case of Gorbachev, the unpopularity was, I think, largely derivative of the fact that the state over which he presided was collapsing around his and everybody else's ears. Now, some people applauded that and felt good riddance to Gorbachev. Other people hated it and blamed Gorbachev for the fact that it was breaking up. As for Boris Yeltsin, to some extent, what I'm about to say is not his fault, although to some extent it is. But it is, again, objectively true that during virtually all of his presidency, Russia was a great roiling mess. It was constant chaos. It was one showdown and crisis after another. There are a lot of people in the room who know Russia very well. I'm sure they heard the same thing from their Russian friends. The Russians would tell me all the time, you know, we are suffering from crisis fatigue. And President Clinton worried about that. I remember after one trip, I think it was in '97, he said, you know, I'm really worried about this country. And he was an optimist about Russia. He said, this is a country that seems to be undergoing a nonstop, what did he say, emotional breakdown. And it was really true. And when I would ask Russians, well, what do you most want from your next president? This is towards the tail end of the Yeltsin period. The word that they would use in Russian means basically normalcy. We want just, you know, for all of this shouting and screaming to stop so that we can, in some sense, get on with our lives. And I think to some extent, Vladimir Putin has either been able to bring that about or able to get himself identified with that having come about. I think a little bit of both. And if there can be a significant, if there can continue to be not too much in the way of constant crises in Russia, that will keep his popularity reasonably high.
Sir, at the back.
But there's one other thing. One reason that Putin is able to make himself the normalcy president of Russia is because Boris Yeltsin got a lot of stuff out of the way earlier on.
My name is John Hartzell from Dresdner Bank. The president and the vice president in the last few days have started talking about a first strike doctrine, which would have been horrendous back in the old days. But I guess my question is this a doctrine whose time has come? It's specifically in the context, in this case, of terrorists and even terrorist nations or terrorist-labeled nations. Is this a doctrine whose time has come? Is it a dangerous departure? And how does it impact on coalition building, first of all, I guess, with the Russians?
I think that there certainly may be cases where preemptive defense, or what is oxymoronically called preemptive deterrence, may be required. I don't think we should rule it out. And by the way, we never have ruled it out. It's always been a kind of footnote to, or in the small print of, American strategic and defense doctrine. So I don't think in that sense it's a radical new departure. Insofar as it's getting the kind of emphasis as it is by the administration, I think it's going to be quite problematic, particularly in terms of our ability to close some rifts that have developed with our key allies. Our ability to assemble coalitions for what may well be an inevitable and very necessary operation in Iraq. I think it's also troublesome with respect to the Russians. Although we have, I don't think too many Russians worry a lot about this doctrine being used against them. That's actually, I think, one of the significant areas of great improvement in the relationship. When I was working with the Russians on the issue of national missile defense, which was only a year and a half, 2 years ago, the Russians were very concerned then that the combination of national missile defense and American strategic capability, both nuclear and conventional, did mean that we were holding open the possibility of striking them first. That seems to have faded considerably. But in a way, it's kind of indicative or a paradox of our times that we have a lot more disputes on matters of what you might call strategic culture with the West Europeans than we have with the Russians. But I do think there's going to be trouble, and I suspect we're going to see a pragmatic president refine this concept as he continues to talk about it.
Maurice, can you just wait?
Maurice Templesman. One of the challenges that President Putin faced when he came to power was to stop and reverse the centrifugal forces that were basically sort of tearing what was left of Russia apart. He seems to have succeeded to some extent in doing that, but considering the limitations of history, institutions, and power, levers of power that he had, do you think he could have done this in a different way that might address some of your concerns about the free press and the democracy of that?
Yes, I think he could have done it in a better way, and I hope he does do it in a better way over time. Russia is not going to make it as a normal, modern, unified country integrated with the rest of the world unless it continues to develop as a genuine democracy, a pluralist democracy. And I think because of the very size and scope of the country as well as its ethnic makeup, it's going to have to be a highly federalized or federated democracy. And insofar as President Putin's current measures cut against that, I think he's buying problems down the road. We've already talked about Chechnya. Chechnya is a major threat to the unity of Russia. Islamic extremism is far greater in the North Caucasus today than it was 10 years ago because largely of the scorched earth policies that the Russian authorities have carried out there, and because of the extent to which good old-fashioned racism, which has never been very far below the surface in Russia, has come back to the surface. And that has implications for all of the culturally Islamic parts of Russia. The other issue, of course, is the economy. When I first went to Vladivostok in the late 80s, I think it was, the people I was surrounded with there were, for the most part, ethnic Russians, with a few Ukrainians thrown in. So they had no cultural sense of isolation or distance from Moscow, but boy, did they ever want out of the Soviet Union. And that was basically for economic reasons. And so Putin has, as he pursues what I think is basically reformist economic policy, has got to give a lot of attention to the economic development of the far regions of the country.
You mentioned America being the chairman of the boards. Well, we also have a chairman of the board who's been patiently waiting to ask a question.
Thank you.
Hello,
Strobe,
Pete.
how are you? I'd like to press you a bit on the oligarchs and privatization. When David Rockefeller and I took a group there a number of years ago, we were astonished, which is to say utterly dismayed, by the macro corruption that was implicit in the notion that you give half a dozen favored few political supporters billions of dollars worth of interest-free loans that they then proceed to buy vouchers at a penny or two on the dollar using a lot of government money. And given the unbelievably uncompetitive nature of those industries, these oligarchs, as far as I could say, contributed almost nothing to the revitalization of these industries. No fresh capital infusion, no technology, no know-how or anything. Now, when we pressed Chubais for why on earth did they do that, we got two explanations. One was a very tepid and thoroughly uncredible reason that they didn't have a good treasury payment system and they needed to go through the private sector. But the one more passionate one was that it was transcendent that they moved to market mechanisms. And since there was a pretty good chance the communists were going to win, they wanted to make it irreversible, because Lord knows the communists would never have permitted industry to fall into private hands. Could you give us your analysis of why they did that?
Well, I agree with you, Pete. The first argument is bogus. I hadn't even heard it before, but I can easily imagine Chubais saying that. The second argument, of course, had a political force or appeal to it in the time frame when we first heard it, which was 95 and 96. That was the period when they undertook the so-called loans for shares program, which was basically this kind of very exclusive orgy of inside trading made available to the oligarchs so that they could buy up many of the assets of the old Soviet state for ridiculously low prices in exchange for their political, financial, and media support for President Yeltsin in the campaign against Zyuganov in 96. And remember, of course, that Zyuganov seemed to be on a roll. There are people whose judgment I respect, who make the argument that Yeltsin didn't really need the oligarchs to win, and that, by the way, the oligarchs so needed Yeltsin to win that they would have supported him anyway, even if it hadn't been for the loans for shares scheme. I can believe that. It's a counterfactual, but it's a plausible one. There's no question that the oligarchs are a multiple disgrace and drain on Russia for the reasons that you say, and also, of course, they have inspired a lot of disillusionment among regular Russians with the economy, with the reform, with democracy, with support from the West, and so forth. So there's a price that they and therefore we are going to have to pay for a long time to come. I guess the last point I would end on is predictive, but it does have some plausibility to it, and that is that the oligarchs are a passing phenomenon. I can see how a number of them are already trying to respectabilize themselves in several ways. I'm sure one of them is thinking about starting up a council on foreign relations in downtown Moscow. And they're certainly approaching American universities, including a couple I know very well. And that's more in the symbolic realm. They're also looking for ways to keep their vast amounts of money in Russia and invest in Russia. And that's really the key point. Russia has got to become a genuine rule of law society and economy if it's going to succeed economically. That's the bottom line, I think.
On the economic issue, I wonder if Stan Fisher has something to say or ask. Stan was, of course, the #2 man at the IMF for a very long, distinguished career.
And always my #1 guy.
Thanks, Strobe. Incidentally, on the previous question, the oligarchs, a lot of the oligarchs are actually transforming at the moment in order to protect their property. They're becoming respectable. But what's interesting about it is that I was told that in '92 and '93 and '94 that it was going to happen, and it has happened as predicted. I'm sure this is in the book, but the question I want to ask you is, there have been lots of criticisms of the aid process. I wonder if you could address two of them. The one is, we, the West, should have been far more generous at the beginning, and generous throughout. And there never was any major infusion of foreign funds into Russia, despite what we were being told at the time. And the second is that we were far too interventionist. Shouldn't have used the IMF and the World Bank. If we were going to aid the Russians, we should have given them money and told them to get on with it and do very little about trying to redirect their economy. I assume you reflect on both these things in the book, but what is it?
Yeah, I do, Stan. I do feel that we, by which I mean not just the Clinton administration, but the first Bush administration, of whose policy, by the way, I'm generally very admiring. And Michael Beschloss and I wrote an earlier book giving the first President Bush a lot of credit for kind of being the ground controller for Gorbachev as he brought the Soviet Union in for a soft landing. But I do think that there's a lot more that we could have done early on, particularly in the area of technical assistance and exchanges, people-to-people programs, helping them in institution building, and that kind of thing. As you know very well, Stan, because you were a wise counselor to me on this a couple of times, there was an effort that was well-intentioned, had some promise, but never really came to much in the '93 period to build into the G7-sponsored programs that the international financial institutions were carrying out in the Soviet Union a strong element of social safety net, so that as this process of privatization went about, the workers who were thrown out of work would have some compensation. The workers who kept their jobs, but the jobs were now privatized, would still have the benefits of health care and child care and that kind of thing. That was part of the Tokyo package, as you remember from that year. And we didn't do enough. We and our G7 partners didn't sustain that effort. I think had we done so, it might have helped. What I don't buy is the notion that we should have bypassed the IFEs and simply shoveled money into Russia. I think that the problem that Pete identified a moment ago would have been even more extreme. We would have been shoveling a lot of that money into pockets which would have had big holes in them, and the money would have ended up in Switzerland and the Riviera and London banks and that kind of thing. Larry Summers and I spent an awful lot of those 8 years trying to get right the issue of conditionality. And I recount in the book a couple of fascinating debates between Larry and Chernomyrdin and Primakov about the kind of conflicting laws or rules of economics on the one hand, with Larry arguing the case, and politics of a primitive but real and democratic kind that were happening in Russia. And we never got that, we never were able to reconcile that point. The stringencies required, the fiscal and other stringencies required for sound economics, and the requirements of Russian politicians who had to face voters. So.
I'm Roland Paul with Bayberry and Howard. In the reception hour, you and I talked very briefly about another war, the war in Kosovo. And of course, as we all know, you had a central role in bringing about the settlement of that war in dealings with the Russians. You you praised Chairman Merton in that regard, but surely there must have been some basic element in the U.S.-Russian relationship that got them to turn their back on their ally in a way they did, if that's a fair way to say it, to achieve the peace we needed.
Yeah, it was the single hairiest episode of my experience, and I think in many ways one of the most revealing. It's also as dramatic an example as you're likely to get of the importance of the Clinton-Yeltsin connection, because in order to end the war on NATO's terms, and in order to get Russia to throw its weight behind the effort that Marty Ahtisaari of Finland was involved in, with me working with him, to basically pressure Milosevic into accepting those terms, Bill Clinton had to call in all of his chits with Yeltsin. And there's another institution that played a role here that I give quite a bit of attention to, and that is the G8. Much has been made, much fun has been made of the redesignation of the G7 into the G8. The G8, of course, existed for one reason, and that was to give a forum that was very high profile for where Yeltsin could sit down as an equal with the other G7. There was a G8 meeting coming up in Cologne, and we basically used the argument with Yeltsin repeatedly. You're going to either have to boycott that meeting because the war is still going on, or you're going to have to go to that meeting and walk out and turn a personal triumph into a public embarrassment, or you're going to have to help us end this war. And that means getting Milosevic to pull out of Kosovo and accept our terms. It worked. But boy, I'll tell you, getting there was not half the fun. If there is one episode from the book that I would recommend, it's the scene in the Russian Ministry of Defense the night after the bombing had stopped, but while NATO was poised to go into Kosovo. And I had gone to Moscow to negotiate with the Russians the terms of Russia's participation in the implementation force that was about to go in to Kosovo under NATO command. And before my very eyes, I watched the high command of the Russian military, which is to say the Minister of Defense, the Chief of the General Staff, the top GRU, a military intelligence guy, lie to me repeatedly about the status of a Russian unit that was making its way from Bosnia towards Kosovo, and we had every reason to believe was about to go into Kosovo without coordinating with NATO, and therefore setting up a confrontation between Russia and NATO. We were about to snatch big-time defeat from the jaws of victory. Now, you know, fortunately, my colleagues who had accompanied me to Moscow were sitting outside the room where I was conducting and were watching CNN. So they knew exactly where the Russian forces were and were able to send me in notes from time to time. But there were a number of pieces of evidence that night that the Russian high command was on its own. And I don't know if that's because Boris Yeltsin was indisposed or what. But I think it was not only a disturbing episode for those of us who witnessed it, but I think it obviously had an effect on the Russian civilian leadership, and they put in some additional measures after it was over. It ended well, however, and it ended well because Boris Yeltsin wanted to go to the G8 meeting in Cologne as a hero, which he did, and he wanted to go with all of these issues that had been so contentious, including within his own government, resolved. And we were basically able to say, here are the terms that it'll take to resolve them.
Steve Cohen.
Strobe, as a Russianist and a fellow Russianist, I'd like to ask you a question about poverty in Russia. There's considerable dispute about how many Russians have fallen into poverty since 1991. Reasonably, it's somewhere between 35 and 70%, depending on how you set the poverty level. The government today says it's $55 a month. That doesn't seem reasonable to me. But whatever the case, an enormous number of Russians have fallen into poverty. And Russian sociologists tell us that many of them were middle-class people, like ourselves, which may be without precedent in a previously at least semi-modern country. During the 90s, reading Aesopian, the Sovietologist, statements of the Clinton administration, some of us had the impression that you were the only person who worried about this question of poverty in Russia. There was this famous statement you made that more therapy and less shock was needed. I understand that you later regretted that remark, but I interpret it to mean that you were thinking about this issue of poverty. And then you gave a speech subsequently, I think at Oxford, on the occasion of Isaiah Berlin or some event that I read, and there too you alluded to it. So the question is this, as you watched poverty grow in Russia in the 90s, what did you think? I mean, you semi-love Russia or care about Russia in a deep way, obviously. What did you think about this? Did you feel any, I don't know, what did you think about it? And looking back, since so many are still in poverty, what do you think about it? In two respects, in a humane way, humanitarian way, and strategically in that this is the first time, so far as I know, that a fully nuclearized country has been impoverished, and nobody knows exactly what that means, but it can't mean stability.
Well, Steve, just on the, yeah, Fareed says this is the last question, so this is the last answer. I regretted having used the irresistible soundbite. What Russia needs is less shock and more therapy, precisely because it was a cute soundbite, and of course drove the Russian reformers who were trying to apply modern disciplined economics to their country absolutely nuts. Didn't earn me for that day any accolades in the Department of Treasury either, I might add. But it was a correct analysis, and I never have recanted the point that I was trying to make. By the way, I was not by any stretch of the imagination the only person in the U.S. government who thought about this and cared about this. And I'll tell you who else thought about it and cared about it a lot. And that was the Russia hand, Bill Clinton. And he didn't see anywhere near as much of it as I did. But I can remember going there when we went to St. Petersburg and down to Moscow. As he was driving around looking out the limousine window, he said, you know, a lot of those people either one way or another are kind of giving us the finger. He said, they don't like us very much. They're mad at us for some reason. And he said, I think I know what it is. And that is, a whole lot of hardship and heartache has come with this transition. And, you know, we got to do something. I'm not going to do the accent, okay? We got to do something about that. And that's still, I think, it's the economy, stupid. Now, the only point that I would put sort of counter to the trend of our little dialogue here, where we're kind of in sync, is the good old days. The good old days weren't the good old days. There was an awful lot of poverty in the Soviet Union that got disguised through phony statistics, just as there was an awful lot of corruption and criminality, which, like everything else, was privatized in the early 1990s. But the main thing is that the citizens of the old Soviet Union were not real citizens in any sense of the word that we would recognize, and they were profoundly impoverished in the sense that they were living under a dictatorship. And Russians now have the vote. They can vote in referendums. They can vote for their officials. And over time, let's hope that they vote for officials who will make that country, as the Russians like to say, a normal modern country. I think they've got a very good shot at it, but we obviously have to help them in every way we can. Thank you very much.
Conceal the pen quite yet. Can I get you to autograph?
Strobe Talbot was Deputy Secretary of State during the Clinton administration and will assume the presidency of the Brookings Institution later this year. The Russia Hand is published by Random House. For more information or to read an excerpt, visit their web address at random.com.